who's the executive director of ReFed, a think tank that's creating solutions to food waste. And we are going to talk about some food waste impacts of COVID-19. Dana is going to kick us off with a presentation talking a little bit more about ReFed and the projects that she's working on and what she's observed thus far. And then we will ask some questions. And I would love to get some questions from you, audience. So start thinking about those right now. But for now, Dana, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Catherine, and to the whole Spoon team for inviting me today. This pandemic is affecting all of our lives, and I hope that you are all well. I hope you're all staying sane. I hope that this presentation can give you some things to think about besides washing your hands. And I look forward to sharing with you everything that we have learned. If you're not familiar with ReFed, ReFed works to motivate and mobilize the multiple stakeholders across the food system to activate solutions to reduce food waste. And as a central nonprofit serving this space in the US, we view ourselves as a catalyst promoting solutions, as a convener that facilitates collaborations and partnerships, and as a clearinghouse for disseminating data, insights, and best practices. So hopefully we can do some of that today with you. Much of what I have today will not surprise you. When you abruptly shut off half of the food system, it causes shockwaves. When 10 million people lose their jobs, the need for food assistance goes up. When people who used to go somewhere to get their food can't leave their homes, the food has to come to them, and that causes transportation challenges. So certainly, I know many of you have heard about those themes, but all of those things are having a significant impact on how much food is going to waste across our food system today. And hopefully I'll be able to give you a little bit more color on that. In general, my observation is that waste seems to be pretty low priority of everything that's going on today. But food is very high priority. And so we are seeing, a ton of effort going into trying to save a lot of the stashes of excess that are being found around the food system. But I do think one flip side of that is that because waste is low priority, we're seeing less priority on reduced packaging and many of the efforts that have gone on around that within the food system over the last several years. The food industry really is doing the best they can to donate food, but they're also focused on taking care of their business and their employees as they should be, and dealing with a variety of complexities that have been introduced by the coronavirus, and therefore not always able to dedicate the time or the labor to make that donation happen. And then there is enormous volatility in the system right now, and that is making it really difficult for some of the best solutions to food waste that we typically promote for those to work. So I'll give you an example. There's a whole suite of tools that are being introduced that use machine learning, artificial intelligence to improve forecasting. And one of the best things you can do, especially if you're a grocery store, is be just spot on in your forecasting. And so those tools take all of these patterns for all the 50,000 different items in a grocery store, and they help that store forecast better. Well, you just can't forecast around what's happening now based on patterns in the past. And so, I think we'll see that volatility means that it's very difficult for stores to predict what they're going to sell, and that ultimately could lead to significant more waste coming out of retail as the months go on. So what I thought I would do today is start by walking through the supply chain and summarizing some of the main trends that we've observed. To arrive at these conclusions, we at ReFed have joined over 25 different conversations around the food system impacts of COVID-19, as well as conducted our own qualitative survey with about 80 respondents from across the food system. So that's kind of where we're getting some of this information. and figure out the slides here. Are those slides advancing, Catherine?
No, but we can pick it up. And Mike, do you have to do that?
I think it's resident in the app, the presentation app.
All right. Let's see here. Sorry, everyone.
That's okay.
Let's try this again. I'm lost on my computer. Okay. There we go. Did that move for you?
I think you need to represent it. So if you can
Okay.
click over your face and then choose presentation.
Sorry about that, everyone. All right, I think I've got it now.
No worries.
Perfect.
Okay, great. Sorry about that, everyone. Can't have a presentation without a technical difficulty here. What I thought I would do is just walk through the food system and give you a sense of what we're seeing at each stage, and specifically kind of where there's waste happening and why at each stage. So here's a very rudimentary picture of the food system. Really, in reality, there tends to be two different supply chains, certainly with some crossover, but for retail and for restaurants and food service. And of course, when you just stop half of that supply chain, it has a ripple effect throughout that supply chain. And as many of us know, retail is experiencing a huge surge right now. And so, of course, many of the farms, processors, and distributors that tend to serve food service are eyeing the retail market and trying to establish new channels there. So generally speaking, we are hearing stories of a huge amount of waste happening on farms. As that whole side of the supply chain has closed, those farms are trying to find those retail channels, but it's not that quick. It's not that instant. And of course, they have products that they're harvesting. Sometimes a day or two in harvest can make or break, whether or not you're going to harvest that item. So we're hearing stories of millions of pounds of green beans, of tomatoes, I think 10 million pounds of tomatoes at one operation in Florida, 2 million pounds of green beans, 4 million pounds of cabbage, giant quantities that are just getting tilled under because they can't find the outlets for it. They certainly are looking for those other outlets. Some are looking to go direct to consumer, and others are trying to establish new retail channels. There's also a potential supply risk due to farm labor shortage from immigration restrictions and possibly COVID-19 itself plaguing the farm worker workforce. In either of those situations, you could have entire fields that are ready to harvest. They do have a market, but they just can't find the labor to actually do the harvesting of that product. And so we're hearing a lot that could be a risk to come. And lastly, most farmers markets have been closed. And so certainly for smaller farmers that depend on those as outlets, that's been a challenge for them. For processors and manufacturers, they are experiencing 2 to 3 times the demand as normal from their retailers. But they're also looking forward at their facilities that have social distancing challenges and then employee illness that could be affecting production. So PepsiCo had to close its Frito-Lay's plant recently because there were some affected employees We're hearing about the potential for this in slaughterhouses being a challenge, because you can't simply, turn off the fact that an animal is ready for slaughter. Similar in dairies where they're milking, you can't just stop a cow from milking. And so in these products that need kind of consistent both harvest, if you will, and processing, limited labor could actually affect the production and therefore lead to some of those kind of raw ingredients going to waste within processing. Then we are seeing some kind of fun stories about alcohol makers shifting their production to fight pandemic. But we're also hearing from upcyclers, who are those kind of trying to make a separate product from the byproducts of a processor. So sometimes it's, for instance, a brewery, and they're making a flour out of the spent grain. We're hearing from some of those upcyclers that the processors either are slowing down or closing, and then that's preventing them from being able to make their products as well. Distributors have been left holding the product in a number of cases. There's surplus food in warehouses due to canceled orders, and food service distributors like Cisco are seeking retail channels, and wholesale produce markets are in distress. The LA wholesale produce market is reporting that sales are down 90%, and just stories of these people just sitting with, tons of food, both at the wholesale market itself and then in their own warehouses, that has a very limited shelf life and much of it going to waste. United Airlines, in terms of just surplus food that distributors are holding onto, United Airlines canceled 40,000 cheese trays, as an example. And the distributor was left just sitting on those orders and trying to find another outlet, which is not always easy. And while they are seeking retail outlets, it can be quite challenging because much of that product is not packaged to be sold at retail. And sometimes it's just different product, like that cheese tray. We've also heard of popcorn kernels that are not being sold because movie theaters have been closed, and other challenges like that. At retail, as we've all heard, there's been a huge demand surge. Kroger, for instance, reported 30% more sales this March than previous March. And part of what that means is that the donations from retailers have actually gone down during this period. So Feeding America actually cited that their the amount of donation they were receiving from food retailers had actually gone down about 35% since shopping around this pandemic began. Another thing we're seeing is just e-commerce. As I'm sure you've heard, it has exploded. Anyone who does direct-to-consumer boxes is experiencing just multiples of their normal demand. And I actually think that creates an interesting potential for waste reduction in the future. For now, I think they're just trying to keep up with demand and to some extent absorbing some of that product that is excess from the food service supply chains. As an example, average daily online sales for groceries doubled by the middle of March compared with the start of the month, according to one source. And what's been interesting is that there have been some efforts to just really connect the food service companies with the retailers to sell off the product that they do have. And so you're seeing some of the produce associations that are out there making those connections because those businesses didn't necessarily know each other to begin with, but doing a good job of that and trying to save some of that food that would otherwise be going to waste. Again, as I mentioned, there's volatility in sales expected, which is going to be a challenge for forecasting and certainly could lead to waste. And then Kroger and others are predicting that this could be a potential long-term shift towards eating more at home. And that actually, again, I think it does have some potential towards waste reduction if we can instruct consumers on how they're managing food and make sure that they're doing a good job of that. In the restaurant and food service category, what we saw was a huge spike in excess as these restaurants were all closing and trying to figure out what to do with their raw ingredients. Some really innovative solutions, various restaurants turning themselves into grocery stores until they had sold off their ingredients. Some finding ways to become more of a soup kitchen for another food assistance program rather than a restaurant, and others making meals for health workers that are doing stuff. So some interesting innovations that I'm sure you've heard about it over the course of the day. But certainly the big story in the donation world is that there was a huge spike in donations, too much for the system to handle in some cases, but then it's dropping off, and there's quite a bit of concern around food shortages as time goes on, especially as there's such increased demand for food assistance right now. Also, there could be a drop in demand for high-end or exotic products that people don't typically shop for at the grocery store and cook at home. And so some of those products could be left in a warehouse, and depending on how perishable they are, struggle to find an outlet before they do go to waste. And then, of course, mass closures are likely. Someone at the James Beard Foundation told me how they opened their relief fund to offer micro grants to restaurants. They opened it at 3 p.m. and had to close by 6 p.m. on the same day because they'd already received 4,200 applications for those micro grants. So I think we are certainly expecting those, and I think it's unclear right now what impact that would or could have on waste in particular. With consumers, the hoarding behavior, I think, has a great potential to lead to more waste because people tend to waste more at homes when they're outside of their typical habits. And so when you have all of that food, people are not necessarily used to managing it very well. They may or may not have the kitchen skills to know when or how to freeze food or preserve it in other ways. And I expect that we'll see an increase in household food waste from this initial hoarding. Certainly, there's been an increase in the amount of food scraps being produced, and cities like San Francisco and New York are seeing that in their food scrap collection programs. But I think long term, there's a more promising outlook because as people build those cooking skills, I know my husband has figured out how to make lasagna during this period already, which I'm thrilled about because he's not usually one doing the cooking. So as people are building those cooking skills, that could not only lead to an increase in grocery demand, but also just more comfort in the kitchen, which tends to lead to less waste in a household. So just to highlight a few of the key challenges that we heard from some of our research, you can see that the same ones tended to show up regardless of who was answering the questions. And those were transportation, labor, and cold storage. And then this concern that there could be food shortages coming up as time goes on, and therefore some of these recipient agencies really needing funding so that they could either purchase the food that they need to purchase that they typically have donated but are not expecting to have donated, or that they could purchase the transport. And we have companies like DoorDash that are offering that last mile transport that didn't used to be necessary for a place like a soup kitchen, but now they are bringing that to somebody's home and needing to cover the cost of that last mile transport. So we're seeing that. And then, of course, volunteers within the sort of food bank and food recipient, food assistant agencies, volunteerism has gone way down. Many of the volunteers tend to be in the older age categories, and just generally with people not leaving their homes, we're seeing that as a problem. In fact, the The California Association of Food Banks actually requested 20,000 National Guard from the governor's office just to meet that lack of volunteerism and the needs that they had, that they were projecting to have to deliver food to people, as well as kind of pick it up from the places they needed to. The need has really been dramatically increased. Some places are citing a 6-fold increase in demand, places being the food assistance agencies. In South Florida, there was one example where it was a food pantry that instead of having people shop in the pantry now was putting groceries into the trunks of cars, and they were actually, they had a line of 8 miles long of cars just to receive food there. So pretty significant need. At ReFed, we focused on trying to be a connector and create resources, but also connect those working on the ground with each other, because they are so busy trying to meet the need in their own communities and pivoting whatever their typical model is to meet this situation, that they just haven't even had time to lift their heads up and figure out what other food recovery organizations are doing. So we've been pretty active in trying to organize a best practice discussion series around that, and then also to find funding. And with just a short amount of poking around, we found $19 million worth of requests from those smaller agencies that are doing the on-the-ground work to help them pivot and meet their current needs. So some of the challenges that we're hearing from those food rescue organizations is that they don't have proper storage, that their warehouse space that they typically rent has actually stopped giving them access to the building, and that's creating problems, that their regular streams of food are down, but in the meantime, they're receiving really large and unpredictable donations from other places, that their fundraisers are being canceled, as well as needing funding to kind of pivot their different models. Some of the changes that they're making on the ground are trying to pilot new programs, have kind of rapid response volunteers that they can get out. They're hiring drivers that they didn't used to do, and conducting, that last mile delivery to individuals, as well as having to pack up items they didn't used to have to pack up. And then trying to empower others in their community to deliver food and sort of generate that community action, as well as creating new partnerships. So here's a few examples. You have Boulder Food Rescue that is now trying to create, they typically deliver food on bicycles, but they pick it up from a place that has extra food, like a restaurant, and they bring it to the food rescue agency. Now they're doing deliveries all the way to homes, and they're trying to generate others in their community to have kind of a resident-led workforce that can help deliver food to their neighbors who are food insecure. You have Oside's Kitchen Collaborative in Southern California that is purchasing the restaurant's food inventory and actually using that to create meals to then donate. And they're also hiring former restaurant employees to do that. And you have a place like Second Serving of Houston, which they actually got a whole party tent rental that wasn't happening because all the events had been canceled, and created a whole mass meal production program with a local chef to help feed unemployed restaurant employees. So a lot of creativity out there on the ground. And here you can see some impacts. What you'll notice is they are all kind of record breaking. 13,000 pounds was a record for Second Servings of Houston. City Harvest in New York is experiencing a tripling of food kind of initially in that initial bump. And then a huge amount being moved by the Means database as well, which is one group that organizes the connections and coordinates them. But again, these are expected to drop off, and then they're looking at really just needing funding to help buy the food and deliver some of these services. So with that, I will stop. That was a lot. And just take any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much. And looks like we did get some great audience questions. Tiffany's question actually sort of links in with one of the big ones I had of my own, which is obviously right now, food waste is maybe not at the top of people's minds. They're more worried about procuring food safely, feeding their families, and staying as well as they can. But you did mention that down the road, this closure of restaurants is forcing us all to cook a lot more than we typically do, and that could catalyze a longer term shift towards eating more at home. Pair that with sort of a scarcity of food right now and people having to really rely on what they have at home, lest they want to go stand in a grocery line for an hour. Do you think that will prompt a more long-term behavior change around food waste, positively or negatively? And would just love to hear your thoughts on how that could really radically change the way that we treat food in our kitchen, which is a huge source of food waste in general.
Yeah, I do. I think at its root cause, especially in households, food goes to waste. Part of it is like, how much do we value our food? Right. And so what we're seeing right now is that food has really been elevated in terms of its value for us. And we're seeing that in hoarding behaviors, and, it plays out in a few different ways. But I think ultimately, to your point, people don't want to go to the grocery store. Right. And so there's this new hurdle, which makes you want to use the food you have before you have to go over that hurdle. And so I think people will find themselves, maybe trying something after the date when they haven't done that before, maybe trying to figure out a recipe to cook whatever they have left in the fridge when that's something they didn't used to do. So I do think, and also maybe actually actively looking up, can I freeze this? How do I freeze this? Oh, this is about to go bad. Taking some of those extra steps. What is the best way to store mushrooms? And trying to learn that. So I think that we will come out of this with much more familiarity in the kitchen. And between that and sort of this experience of valuing food in a different way, I think there is potential for that to lead to a reduction in food waste in homes, for sure.
We'll also come out of it with a lot more sourdough bread enthusiasts, which I count myself among. So, a question from Dev Chef Scott. Due to how expensive frozen storage can be, how does COVID affect the future of high volume perishable items, particularly animal proteins? Will we be more cognizant of storage processes in the supply chain?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. When I look at like the current system, and even there's a lot of food going to waste in this moment, right? But I don't really see that in particular as a failure of our food system, because I don't think we ever could have anticipated that, this would come to such a screeching halt. But I do think we'll find ourselves on the other side wanting those kind of backup plans a little bit more. And freezing is like the best backup plan out there. It's like this magic pause button that we get to push on our food. So I think you'll find restaurants like being more willing to invest in an extra freezer just in case some other crisis were to come up. And not just restaurants, but just in homes, freezer sale. I saw somewhere that those secondary freezers that go in your garage, you couldn't buy one when this first started because they had just flown off the shelves. And so I think actually all the way along the supply chain, we will see a more aptitude towards that. Now, whether or not it actually winds up happening and people, want to pay for it, I think that depends. And then animal proteins is probably the best value, right? Best bang for buck when it comes to freezing. So I think if anywhere, that's where we will see it.
Yeah, like the whole sides of beef that you can buy and just store in your giant second freezer.
Yeah.
And that kind of goes into a question from Akiko about animal-based protein and animal-based production supply chain. And she states that causes huge waste in the farm side and wants to know your thoughts on whether plant-based or lab-grown protein could be a solution to minimize food waste. down the road, maybe, because it looks like she's talking about throughout the supply chain as opposed to just on the consumer side. Once you buy it from the grocery store, you can stick it in the freezer. Don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
If I'm understanding the question right, I think that certainly plant-based diets help from a resource use perspective and kind of an efficiency perspective, and having the most efficient kind of translation from farm to table of calories, right? Or of cropland to calories, or whatever you want to call it. I don't know that I would say plant-based diets, sort of are less prone to having food waste. However, I think meat, actually, people tend to freeze it more often than other things. They actually tend to waste less of it on a pound per pound basis. And fruits and vegetables specifically happen to be one of the highest categories of waste in homes. And so I don't know. I mean, certainly from an overall resource use perspective, there are reasons to go plant-based, but I don't know that it's a direct, specifically around waste.
Got it. I wanted to pivot a little bit and talk about logistics. And you touched on this in your presentation, but we have all this leftover food, especially right now. Things are spiking with restaurants trying to find alternate channels to give all their food or donate. And I'm wondering if you've seen any cool innovation around how to deliver that food to places that are in need. As you said, volunteers can be tricky because people don't want to put themselves at risk of contamination. Are you seeing this as maybe a new opportunity for those who have been laid off, or just cool new contactless automated delivery? Have you seen any sort of innovation around the logistics of getting the food that is in need to the people that actually need it?
Yeah, well, I think I know I've seen both DoorDash and Lyft, and I think Postmates as well. So these companies that tend to kind of work on the gig economy, all of them seem to have some kind of program now that is offering essentially to deliver food to people and to pick it up from, a restaurant with excess, let's say, and bring it to a soup kitchen or other recipient agency, but also to get it from there. There's kind of allowing the soup kitchens of the world to sign up as a restaurant in their system, and then to have that food delivered to somebody at their door without any extra. So they're doing it at cost. And there's kind of grant programs popping up where there are people sponsoring the cost of that. So that's been one. And others where the city, I think the city of Cambridge is actually hiring restaurant workers to cook food and then to have it delivered to people at their doors. And then there's really old school stuff like Meals on Wheels, which has been around. I remember going with my mom as a kid to deliver food, and they're exploding because they've kind of always been doing that, right? So yeah, I mean, I think it's matching the gig economy has been one good sort of innovation that's happened, and it happened really quickly. Another I've heard is school buses. So school buses actually doing the routes that they typically do, but without any children on board, and they're rather delivering food to those who kind of qualify for food assistance, and then in some cases picking up homework, I heard, and keeping the drivers employed and all of that. So that was another kind of neat one.
Yeah, it's fascinating. We have a question from Marion about whether you have seen any interesting innovation or best practices around food waste from outside the US, specifically Europe or Asia. It might be too soon to really be observing any shifts.
I'm sure there are, and I feel like we've been so head down in just our little community here that I'm not sure I know about them yet.
Well, they will emerge, I'm sure. So please message us if you have any. We'd love to hear about them. Yes, Refed would love to check them out. And we have another question from Erica French Arnold about social media. And she asked, do you think social media outlets might help people reduce food waste, especially during this time? If so, how? And then asking if there are any other sources on the top of your mind that you think could help make a dent on food waste, maybe like guided cooking is one that comes to mind, or freezing technologies. you said, just any sort of everyday, maybe from the home perspective, that you think could help mitigate food waste?
Yeah, well, I think when it comes to social media and just kind of online content, I think people can use all the help they can get right now in managing their food. Like I said, everyone's in a very different situation with their home food life, if you will, than they were a month ago. And so it is a moment where people are really open and willing to change their behavior in some way and to take the time to learn how to do other things. And so any guidance that kind of fits within that broad category will be helpful. And so whether that's kind of helping with meal planning or batch cooking and then freezing or techniques to freeze food, any of that I think could be helpful. In terms of technologies in the home, there are some out there that are kind of cool and up and coming. I'm not sure they're accessible right now during this crisis, but I'm excited to see some of the smart Tupperware that's coming online out there that can not only help kind of vacuum seal and preserve your food longer, but can help you remember to use it later, and is kind of connected to Internet of Things. There are some smart defrosters that are used at a commercial scale, but are starting to be online at a more household scale. That I know for me, I freeze a lot of things, but then the hurdle is having to remember to defrost it in time to cook it. So these sort of help that situation. So those are two that come to mind.
Awesome. Yeah, smart defroster. I'm all about that. One word that I heard you saying pretty frequently in your presentation is predictability. And that is something that I hadn't really thought of yet, that all these smart machine learning driven, AI driven tools that, say, grocery stores are using, or restaurants, to try to reduce their food waste and accurately predict, are drawing from data that is no longer really relevant. I'm wondering if you have any insight about how quickly these services could adopt to be useful right now, or if you think that we are just going to have to learn as we go, play it by ear for now, because every day is a new normal, and then eventually sort of even things out down the road.
Yeah. I mean, tell me how long this will last, and I will answer that question for you. I think if this goes on for 6-9 months or something, then yeah, they will adapt, right? But if this is a 2-month thing and it's, kind of peaking and cresting and people, things are changing really quickly, I just think it's really hard. And, it might be manageable for certain products, but, I was in a store the other day and I saw star fruit on the shelf and I was like, who is buying star fruit right now? I mean, that's the other, you're seeing a lot towards comfort foods. And so it's particularly hard to predict for some of those less common foods, how much they'll get purchased.
Yeah, your star fruit comment made me think more about food, local food. I guess this is really only food waste adjacent, but you touched on farmers and how they're trying to figure out new sales channels now that their restaurant partners are closing or reducing inventory. And I'm wondering if you think that this could catalyze a change towards, say, I know CSA sales are up according to some data, and people, even just anecdotally, I have friends who are looking for ways to get more local food because they don't necessarily either trust what they're getting from a big supermarket, it's been handled by a lot of people, or they just don't want to have to go through that channel. They'd rather buy directly from a farm. And I wonder if you think that might be a practice that sticks around after things sort of settle after this crisis, and if you have observed any new sales channels besides sort of traditional CSAs, new interesting partnerships farmers are forming to try to get their products into more consumer hands.
Well, I think anyone who does direct to consumer, whether they're local or not, is experiencing a huge increase right now. Any of the boxes that arrive at your door. I do think people are particularly interested in local food systems right now, though, because of what you mentioned, just sort of knowing where your food is coming from, having it handled less, as well as there's just more inclination to support your own community right now. And the bonus of that is that local food tends to last longer, right? Because it hasn't spent the time in transit, and not just miles of transit, but sitting in a warehouse somewhere and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, the idea that you can still have fresh food during this period is, I think we're all still trying to figure out, like, are we going to come to this period where we're eating the Chef Boyardee we wound up buying or not? And so I think people are, as long as it's available, I think people are pretty eager to have that. And I do think it'll last for a certain percentage of the people doing it. And I think that is true for e-commerce in general. The hardest thing is to get people to try it the first time. And you have all of these people trying it the first time and actually for a couple months building the habit. And I see a lot of promise in some of those, in just e-commerce in general, to actually reduce waste eventually, because it really gives it gives a little more warning. It skips some steps along the supply chain and allows you to kind of predict your sales a little bit better when given a little bit of advance notice. So certainly what we're seeing now, where you have to order 3 days in advance to be able to pick your stuff up from the grocery store,
Right.
That's actually a really good model for the grocery stores to be able to order only what they need.
All right. Thank you so much. That's all the time we have right now for this session. Dana Gunders of Refed. Dana, if you want, you can share your email over here in the comment section. People can reach out or find you on LinkedIn. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. Stay well, everyone.
Yes. And we'll be
Bye.
back in just a couple minutes with our next session, so don't go anywhere.